Glenn Bilby, välkommen. Du får börja. Jag presenterar dig själv lite snabbt. Kul att du är här.
Kör på engelska, det är okej? Det kommer ta 90 minuter annars. Okay, so I'm going to discuss big picture on functional training. Sebastian later on will talk about some more details on skating. As an Australian, it would be embarrassing for me to pretend I know so much about skating, although we have won a gold medal, I'd like to say or two, but that's not true. Mostly because everybody else fell over. It's kind of funny. So the focus for the next 45 minutes will be on functional training for performance. As a physiotherapist, I have a tendency to fall into injury management. I'm going to try not to do that because the theme for today is more on performance. I will present most of the material that's common to the red cord courses and common to the red cord methods that are being used downstairs. My background is an exercise physiologist. In the beginning I worked a lot with elite athletes since the late 1980s. Got interested in injuries, did a little bit of research on strength and conditioning, mostly conditioning for speed and explosivity, which is quite common to a lot of the skating sports. Very interesting time back then. The discussion was on rate of force development. We didn't really talk so much about power, but how you can hit the ground and leave the ground as quickly as possible. And we borrowed a lot of information from Europe. Some really good guys in Finland and some other people in Eastern Germany and some of the more eastern countries in Europe. I've been teaching at a couple of universities, mostly on biomechanics and exercise physiology, so that's my area. I'm a bit of a nerd when it comes to that sort of thing, but actually I'm more of a practitioner when it comes to applying training methods and principles. So I'm going to pitch it at a practical level, but I'm going to base it in some fairly solid physiology and biomechanics. So when is training functional? It's a really good question. There's a lot of discussion about functional training. It's fairly hot in Sweden right now. It's been a discussion for about 25 years in Australia. There's all kinds of things in Australia, funny devices that you can use for functional training. And there's been a little bit of an attitude in the common fitness market. If you go to Sats or if you go to Friskis, anything that's not in a machine is considered functional training. An elastic band is functional training. A medicine ball is functional training. And actually, I'd like to say that I don't consider that true. What's functional is that which is connected to a particular performance, a particular sport, or a particular activity at work or in the home. So functional training needs to be specific. You cannot define functional training unless you define what function are we talking about. Is it sitting in the office? Well, there's functional training for that. Is it skating on the ice? There's functional training for that. Is it jumping around on ropes with Cirque du Cirque over on the west coast in the US? Depends. It needs to be periodized. That's really important. It needs to come in phases during a season, during a training program. You can't just train functional in one particular way the entire season. It depends on what position you have on the ice or what position you have on the football field. And it needs to be effective, and I think that's the most important point here. If it's not having an effect in your performance during a match, then it's probably not functional. It may be good training, it might give you big biceps, but maybe that's not relevant for the function you're talking about. So functional training needs to be quite specific. Now that specificity doesn't mean it has to be with an ice hockey stick, it doesn't have to be with a puck, it doesn't have to be with a ball, it doesn't actually have to be on the ground, it can be up in the air. But the forces on the body need to mimic or be the same as the forces on the ice. The body positions need to have the effect of gravity in the same way as they are on the ice. You need to almost have a virtual goggles on that can look at the forces acting on the body, not just the body position. Where is gravity compared to my centre of gravity? Am I moving forwards and backwards? Am I decelerating or accelerating? So we have to step into the world of biomechanics to understand how to design functional training. If you don't know biomechanics, you can't design functional training. All you can do is copy what other people recommend. And a lot of the time that's inherited traditional training methods, which may or may not be right, may or may not be functional. So, it has been shown over and over again in the last 15 years that core stability training this section, excuse me, training this section can reduce injuries down in the knees, up in the shoulders. Train the core and you can reduce the incidence of injuries in the knees. Most of us are familiar with that already, but why is that so? That's the important question. And it really boils down to one thing. Our role as a sports person is to move our own centre of gravity forwards, backwards, up and down, sideways. That is what we do. We move our own centre of gravity, so we need to be a master of our own body weight in order to get good function in performance. I think it's a fantastic picture. This person obviously is not in tune with their own centre of gravity, and I suspect it's the man. It's always more convenient to blame the man. It's probably the man who lost his balance and then dropped the lady. And the poor lady, she's got amazing flexibility there. A little spondylolisthesis after this accident. Not only does he have to master his own centre of gravity over his own base of support, he has to manage her centre of gravity and the combination of the two. So there's a very good chance that the resultant centre of gravity was out here and his skates couldn't quite find the right place. Now if we look at this picture here, it's a bit small for you. There's a huge sumo wrestler here and a little boy. Big centre of gravity, both of them. Wide base of support, centre of gravity between the feet. Why? Well, that's the most stable position to be in. And that's the purpose of sumo wrestling, to try and move the centre of gravity outside of the base of support. It's as simple as that. And when you look at normal function here, you can see that this person's centre of gravity is going outside of their feet, outside of base of support, and that is causing that person to move forwards. We do not want to prevent that in sports performance. That is the very nature of having speed. You want to be off balance as much as possible, but you want to be off balance under control. If you lose control and you decrease the time you have to react because you are moving at speed, then the risk of falling is much greater. But if you have higher core control, you can control your centre of gravity, then your margin for error can be reduced. So most people are familiar with these back muscles coming in and lifting us up. That's what the average person, including the average sports person, will be thinking. It's my back muscles that are lifting me up. Most of us here know that that's a more complicated picture than that. The feet are connected to the floor. And when you go forwards, soleus, a deep muscle here, is pulling your knees backwards. The average person thinks soleus is responsible for pushing us up on our toes. But actually one of soleus's primary roles is to pull our knees backwards. So there's a chain of events that happens all the way from the feet in order to lift this person's shoulders up. And to be functional, you have to train the entire chain of muscles. You cannot just separate the back muscles. You can't just put them over a bench and put a weight on the shoulders and get them to do back extension exercises and think that that's good functional training. It's good training. It trains the erector spinae group, but it does not connect this global muscle to the other muscles in the chain. It's the other muscles in the chain that make it functional. So, here's the erector spinae group. And this is what it looks like in function. Extending the back and the abdominals flexes forwards. It's as simple as that. There's a balance area here and a lever mechanism here, and the rib cage acts as a lever as well. And it bends us forwards and lifts us up, and the distance between here and here is called a lever arm. It's like the handle on a door, and the longer the lever arm, the easier it is to open the door. The better the curve, the easier it is for the back muscles to lift us up. But we've grown up in a fitness society that says that we should have a kneep, we should have a flat back. We have people teaching lifting and saying, tuck under first, go down and come up again because it gives you a strong core. Who lifts heavy weights? You guys lift heavy weights. You know you need to get your little tailbone up first in order to pre-activate the deep muscles that control your pelvis before you bother to go down and up. But there are still people in elite sports teaching heavy lifting saying, tuck under, suck your navel in and go down with 100 kilos. Oh, what a nightmare. That is the basis of functional training. Knowing the mechanics of the body parts and how they fit together before you design your training programs. So, here's another picture of another group that works in combination with this group. These are superficial muscles. They're easy to train because you can see them. So people love to train things you can see. That's why biceps get so much attention. These muscles are deeper. You've got a rectus spinae group and a group called multifidus, and you've got the iliopsoas group, and they work deep inside. They're the underdogs. They're the defence in a football field. Nobody notices them, but they win the match. These are the guys that control the pelvis and make it possible for all the other muscles to pull on the levers, the bony levers in the body. These need attention in functional training. So back to our sumo, back to our chap doing a forward bend, or the waiter position as they say in academic circles. A rectus spinae needs to work, yes. It lifts up the rib cage on the pelvis, but the hamstrings, they do a big job here. But the hamstrings cannot pull on the pelvis if the pelvis is not stable. And the erector spinae can't pull on the pelvis if the pelvis is not stable. And if you just ask hamstrings and the back to work, pulling down and pulling up, and the pelvis is not stable, the poor back joints start screaming, saying, hey, what's going on there? Too much pull, nothing happening in between. So you must bring on the core stability package. And that is a complicated package. It's lots of muscles. And they're usually muscles that do not respond to heavy lifting. And what do we normally do in elite sport? Too much testosterone, too heavy, not enough finesse. Back in 1989, we tried to introduce Pilates to Australian rules football teams. Oh boy, that didn't go down too well. You've seen Australian rules football? It's sort of like camp sport on grass. And these guys just want to be rough and ready. Pilates, not possible. 1991, we tried to do yoga. Boy, that didn't go down too well either. Until we took in a beautiful girl who stood there in front of 40 guys and everybody attended. So this core stability has been around a long time in Pilates and yoga. It's been around for hundreds of years in yoga. But we've only really just embraced it probably the last 25 years, 30 years. So, let's go to performance. Core stability has been shown to improve performance. Training the core, not just static stability, but controlling it forwards, backwards, left and right and around in circles, has been shown scientifically to improve performance. So if we have a look at this situation, which doesn't look too pretty, and then divert it to this. Wow, where's the base of support? Where's the motion? Which forces are acting? There's a whole lot of diagonals happening here. This picture is full of diagonals. And that's functional. The body actually works on levers and rotation and diagonals the whole time. There are no straight lines. So, if we have a look at this, and we superimpose the muscles of the back on this lady's back, she is going into extension. She's lifting her right hip into hip extension. Her poor hamstrings are probably screaming, but he's being very gentle and lifting her leg up for her. And you can't see it here. You can see it here. Her left arm is back. So she has a muscle sling connecting the left shoulder to the right hip through latissimus dorsi, the thoracolumbar fascia, into the right glute. They're all working together as a diagonal chain in order to lift her up and hold her up in that position. It's fantastic. And it's complicated. There's so many muscles involved here. Now, this is the diagonal I'm talking about. And this is not unusual. In therapy circles, most people know about this. A lot of the stuff coming out of Holland is specifically looking at the anatomy of the body in 3 dimension, in diagonals, instead of like this. Only dead people look like this. Real people don't stand like that. They're in different positions. They're usually on 1 leg, not 2. So we need to start looking at the anatomy in a functional way in order to design functional training. So, her core needs to be on, because her core is the basis for the hamstrings to work, for the glutes to work, for the back muscles to work, and for the trunk muscles to work. If she does not have good control here, and it may not be maximal strength, it may be submaximal, but if she does not have good control, she cannot use her levers, her arms and her legs. Risk of injury. So, if we look at the core, we need to look down on the body and see that it's a ring, a pelvic ring and a rib cage ring. And the rib cage sits on the pelvis, so we have 2 rings that twist on each other. What stabilizes them and keeps them in a nice plane for rotation? What stops them bending when you do a golf swing? What makes this happen instead of this happen? It's these muscles here on the deep core, transversus abdominis and internal oblique. They need to be working. They need to be listening. What's happening to my trunk? They need to be sending messages to the brain, and the brain says, too much on the left, a bit more on the right, please. And that gives us good axial rotation around the spine. Good movement around the spine for pure movements. Once you've got that good axial rotation, so the wheels on the car are parallel with each other instead of one forwards and backwards. The wheels on the car are parallel, then you can start driving. And the muscles in the trunk, the obliques, the ones that throw, the ones that punch, the ones that hit the puck, these are the ones on the outside. It's like a big steering wheel in a bus. The lever arms are long so that you can powerfully hit the puck. They're on the outside. And they rotate around this axis. So you have a big steering wheel. It looks more like an aeroplane's steering wheel. So you need to train in this axial control in order to get the best out of these big levers when you do rotation exercises. And that's nearly every sport that exists. Maybe not darts. That's probably an exception. So if we look at the man now, he's a bit different. He's more upright. Her relationship with gravity, all right? You have to put on your biomechanics goggles now. Her relationship with gravity is this, through her body. His relationship is up. So it's different. And in order to design training for them, you need to think about, with your biomechanics goggles on, what forces are acting here? Not which muscles, that comes after. First, what forces are acting? So he needs core stability as well, because he's shifting his body weight forwards and leaving his hip behind. And if he's got no core stability, he'll do this and open up. And you'll think, oh, he loses his trunk. He also loses his hip. And if he doesn't have his hip on the ice, he's kaput. You need your hip on the ice, otherwise you can't do much at all, because that's what drives everything that happens underneath. Sebastian can tell you more about that later on. So, same thing. Good core control from the deep muscles. That's the foundation. And then good rotation control from the oblique muscles. That's where the power comes from. Now, if we look at the slings that go across his trunk, now we're getting a little bit more complicated. Most people think that the action is coming from the trunk and the shoulders and the quadriceps in this position. But don't underestimate the relationship between the groin muscles, the adductors, on the left side and the trunk muscle to the right side. He screws his skate into the ice and he throws his pelvis forwards by using these muscles down here in what's called reverse origin insertion. The hip is not understood very well. The hip is not trained very well. Most people train in this direction for the hip, and this direction for the hip, and this direction for the hip, but they completely forget rotation. It's mostly martial arts that works with trunk rotation, because they know if you screw your foot in the floor and you throw your hip forwards, bang, that's where the kick comes from. Even my guys at Tottenham Hotspur's football didn't understand, the strikers, that the ball goes in the goal faster if you're stronger in the hip rotation muscles. They sat on a knee extension machine and did this instead, because they thought that the foot kicked the ball and the ball was connected to the knee. It's the hip, it's connected to the hip. So this muscle swing here is so important. So I'm just going to show a little bit of biomechanics here. This javelin thrower, hopefully he's not on the ice, hits the ground and he's using a muscle sling on the back of the body to make him long. And when that muscle sling is pulling backwards, the one on the front is getting a nice long stretch. And that stretch is gathering energy, elastic energy. It stores that elastic energy for less than a second. That's important. Timing's important here. Then the hip muscles gather the energy inside the deep hip and stabilize the hip so that we don't lose all that energy in the middle. That's core stability. And then when he's ready to throw, milliseconds before he reaches the end, he gets ready to throw and he gathers energy from the elastics and then converts it to a forward movement. That's how the muscles work. That is called the stretch shortening cycle. And it occurs between many muscles and it has to be very carefully timed. So if you stand with a cable machine and do this and think that you're training functional, you need to think again. If you stand with an elastic band, which is easy here and difficult here, and you think you're training functional, you need to think again, because the timing is completely different. It's good training, and it might teach the muscles to work together, and it might be good for rehab because you can control the load, but it's not functional, it's not specific. Right, so let's look at this. Elastic energy here, getting collected on the way back. Moving parts. These muscles need to talk to each other. Hip muscles, abdominal muscles, pectoral muscles, pec minor muscle, coracobrachialis muscle, forearm muscles. Are you ready? And then it's ding, 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 ding. And the elastic energy is released. You must have stabilizing parts at different parts of the body to let this happen. Because if those big muscles that are storing elastic energy just do whatever they want, they're going to dislocate the shoulder on the way. The pelvis, instead of holding itself here and collecting energy, is just going to rotate backwards. And you'll end up throwing the javelin out there. So you need to have this housekeeping, if you like, in the background. This solid support, stabilizing activity throughout the body. And on top of that, let the big muscles throw the spute, the javelin. Okay, so, how do you like my animation? Posterior sling absorbs energy. Hip rotators control. Ping! You throw it. Bang! I discovered that yesterday. I thought I'd better try it. And that's where your power comes from. It's a sequence of events in the right proportion. And it's the proportion you train with specific and functional training. In the end, you have to throw the javelin in order to ultimately be good at throwing javelin. You can't just be in the gym. I think you all know that. So, the building blocks here are based on synergy between the muscles. Sometimes you get a weak link between these muscles. Let's say it's the hip. So you have to isolate it, take it out, and give it a specific exercise with the same forces. Put your biomechanics goggles back on and analyze the movement and say, that's what's missing in that chain of events. That's their weak link. I need to train that first. As soon as you're satisfied with that, and it can happen really quickly, you put it back in the entire movement. That's really important. Put it back in the entire movement. As soon as they understand it, put it back in the functional movement. And you need to train this stretch shortening cycle. It's about timing. You have to train sequence. You have to train timing. Don't get stuck in elastic bands, because it's nearly the opposite to most sports movements. Javelin, power here, easy here. Elastic bands, easy here, difficult here. You'll make them worse. Golfers, elastic band, easy here, or difficult here. You'll slow them down, you'll make them worse. You'll mess up with their technique. It's okay to do it off season, but don't do it during a season. So, if you're going to do corrective exercise, isolate, fix the weak links, it should have a specific functional outcome. You have to define for yourself and for your athlete, what am I trying to achieve? It's motivating and it keeps you on track. It keeps you honest. If it's not having a functional effect, don't do it again. Change. And that's hard when you've got routines, especially if you've inherited those routines from 50 years of history, training a certain way. It takes a lot of courage to change that. Hard for me anyway. So, what is functional training? It is not any exercise that is not done in a machine. It's also not any exercise that's unstable. Standing on a balance platform is okay. It's good for ankle rehab. It might be good for skating. But for most sports, the world is flat and still. It doesn't rock around like it does in Japan occasionally. So wobble boards are fine, but it doesn't really make them functional. You need to get ground reaction forces from the floor, but the floor is normally still. Make something else unstable instead of the floor. It's also not something that's just dangerous. I've seen a lot of people jumping up on a ball and standing there and doing balance training and thinking it's fantastic training. I've seen case studies of javelin throwers with their knees on a ball and their feet on a ball and pretending to throw a javelin. I'm not quite sure how that's functional. It's interesting, it's challenging, but is it really connected to performance? So don't get caught in just doing stuff that looks fun and interesting. The athletes will love it, like this for example. If this was a footballer, I'd be saying, oh no, look at that, it's training the muscles that turn the feet in. And what's the most common, second most common injury in football? Ankle sprains. And that's exactly the way you injure the ankle, by turning your feet in. It's the wrong way. If anything, it should be a concave ball with the feet out and you're controlling it that way. Here we have elastic bands on a wobble board. Here we have someone on a flow. Flow is great training, probably more relevant for ice sports. Bosu ball and a physio ball. It's all good training, but you need to pick and choose depending on what function you're looking for. You can't just label it functional because it's unstable. Now, if we look at slings specifically, because that'll be part of the theme this afternoon, when you put an accelerometer underneath the sling, you'll see this pattern, and it's about the size of a 5 krona, 5 krona coin. So the instability is definitely there, but it's small. If you do a push-up on a ball, a Swiss ball, the movement's much larger, and the movement comes from the wrist. The movement here comes from the shoulder. So now we're talking about distal control Great for motocross and things like that, compared to proximal control. Probably much more relevant for most sports. And if we put a harness on these guys, put them at a specific height from the floor, we have a force transducer here on the floor. We make sure they push with the same effort, and then we measure EMG in the rotator cuff, which stabilizes the shoulder joint. If you use a solid surface, you get a baseline of 100 on the computer. But if you use an unstable surface, specifically the ropes, 60 centimeters apart, you get an EMG response of 320%. 3 times as much electrical activity in the rotator cuffs using slings compared to using the floor. Maybe we can play around with this after if we get enough time.
Vilket var det på en boll?
Sorry?
Om du använder en boll?
Ja, du får se snart. So, let's look at instability as a theme. Most of us train unstable somehow these days. Are these the same? Same body position, same relationship with gravity, but the rope wants to do something very different to the ball. The ball wants to travel sideways. That's the nature of balls. When they start moving, they keep moving. The ropes, they want to move forwards and backwards. So it's different. This will bring in accessory muscles. Fuskmuskler. This will bring in forwards and backwards muscles. So if it's a football that has to throw, then this is a better exercise. If it's somebody that needs to move sideways, which could be skating, then this is a better exercise. You need to choose. Don't just accept balls because they're in the gym. You need to think, well, what do I really want? And then choose between the two. Then you've got this exercise, the Superman. Are they the same exercise? Most people in the fitness branch say, yeah, it's the same exercise. I can do that on the ball. Aha, okay. Forwards and backwards. This one also wants to move sideways. That's okay, depending on your sport. But look what happens here. This one's harder as you go out because the lever arm, armen, goes out even further. This one, it gets easier. It gets easier because the ball comes under your chest. So if you're training a footballer who needs to be strong here, the first half a second, you don't want to be training with a ball because it's not relevant. It's too easy. The ball comes under and makes it easier for you. You want whatever you're working with to get further away from you, to help you. Now if we look at this exercise, the crunch. This is a granny exercise. This is for mobilizing the hip. This is easy. Because as you bring the knees up, the ball comes under you and the lever arm gets shorter and it makes it very easy. But most people think this is a difficult exercise. It's not. It's a balance exercise for the hands and shoulders. It's not a trunk exercise. It is when you stretch the leg out again, but not when you bring the knees up. That's a rest. So if you want to train skiers or ice skaters for hip flexion control, you don't give them this. This is for mobilizing the hip, not strengthening it. You give them this. This helps them lift their knees up because you're working against gravity here. Here you're working with gravity. So they're not the same. They're both good, but they're different. So here's the answer to your question, Nulve. US military did some studies here. They looked at push-up on the floor, steady, push-up on balance cushions, unsteady, push-ups on ropes, unsteady. If you look at this visually, the unsteadiness here happens in the wrists. And it's a bigger movement because the cushions want to move a lot more. If you look at this, the unsteadiness is in the shoulder. So it depends on what you measure. So if you put EMG on the forearm muscles, you'll see much more activity here. But the EMG activity in the shoulder will be much less here. In fact, the EMG activity in this exercise is less than on the floor. So if it's shoulder rehab or shoulder performance training for stability, just do it on the floor. Don't do it on a cushion. Don't do it on a ball. Do it on the floor. But if you really want to up the EMG activity, up to 300, do it in the ropes. Now if we measured the forearm muscles, which we didn't, you can see the electrodes are here up on the rotator cuff, then you'd be better off doing this exercise, say for motocross, or even for skating if you want to get some finesse in the forearms with the shoulder, ice hockey. So what is functional training? It must mimic the task. If it's ice hockey, put him in a situation with a stick and make it relevant. Because if you train a task mentally, the body becomes prepared. Physically, you mimic the forces that they use in their sport. It's much more relevant, much more functional. You have to think about the external forces acting, gravity, the internal forces created in the body. Is it coming all from the shoulders, or is he getting good control from the trunk? You have to think about the timing, and you have to think about the sequence of muscles, the spatial arrangement of the muscles. It's a lot. It's a lot of things to think about. It is easy to read a book written by a functional training expert that says on page 37, ice hockey players should train like this. But there is no guarantee that that person has thought through how should I train for hockey. Not from a biomechanical perspective, probably from a historical perspective. So, more training is not always better. And that's really the case when it comes to functional training. Functional training, you want the brain to be fresh and you want the body to be fresh so you can learn. My Swedish is terrible when I'm tired. It's absolutely shocking. So you can't send me to Svenska för invandrare when I've had a big night out on Friday night. It won't work. I can't understand anything. I can't say anything. My muscles don't work. It's the same with athletes. Train functional when they're fresh, not when they're tired. If you want metabolic changes, you can whip them to death so that they fall down on the ground and they'll wake up 2 days later with better lactic acid tolerance. But don't do it in a functional training scenario. Fresh. So here's an example of functional training. It should be progressive. You need to meet the athlete where they are on that day. If they've had a match on Saturday, let them rest on Sunday and train them functional on Monday. Don't bother on Sunday. Let them rest. If they've got an injury, that will interfere with their movement. Their pain will interfere. Let the pain settle down and then go into functional. And then make sure it's safe. And it's really important. If you're going to push the limits of an athlete functionally so that they're absolutely at their limits, make sure it's safe. It's not okay to get injured at training. Unless you're in contact sports and you're really out there pushing it. But for functional training, they should not get injured. So, first, be specific, isolate. We'll do a little bit of this afternoon. We'll assess, find a weak link, and isolate. This guy had a groin problem, and he had a lot of treatment over many years, and he was worth a lot of money. So he had to have some very specific treatment for the muscles to make them stronger first, before we went into functional stuff. Then we got him into more functional stuff over time. And then we got into really functional stuff afterwards. And then he gets back on the ice and kicks ass. That's the perfect scenario. So, here's the model. First, isolate the problem. You've got to test first. Some sort of test that's relevant. Whoops. Then you need to integrate it. Once you've fixed the isolated part, integrate it with everything else. And then improve the tolerance. Tolerance is metabolic. It takes time. It doesn't happen overnight. 6 to 12 weeks is what you could expect to improve somebody's metabolic stage. You need to pay attention to dosage. Dosage is important. Hur många? What is the intensity? What is the volume? How many repetitions? How many sets? And please, forget about the number 10 in your training diaries. Take it away. 10 is lagom. Lagom does not win a match. You either train short and hard, or you train long and expect to get mjölksyra changes, lactic acid changes. 10 is no man's land. It's just an easy number to remember. So try and let go of number 10. And you want to connect your dosages to results. So you're playing ice hockey, you have one chance to score a goal. It takes approximately half a second to hit the puck. That's how your training should look. Half a second. Bang! Okay, go and rest. Go and read the paper. Go and ring your girlfriend. I'll see you in 4 minutes. Sorry, darling, I have to hang up now. I have to go and hit the puck again. But what do you normally see? Bang! 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 Over and over again. Are any of those 110%? No, they're all 80%. So what happens when they play a match? Their functional training pitched at 80% ends up 80% performance out on the ice. You become how you train. So the Bulgarians, when they lift heavy, and they always win, when they lift heavy, they lift 1, maybe 2, and then they rest for 40 minutes. They read the paper. And they do maybe 6 sets in the morning, absolutely no more than 6 sets, and then they go and have a long lunch and a sleep and a massage, and they do the same thing in the afternoon. 6. They do maximum 12 lifts per training session. That's how we train functional, connected to the real performance on the day. So, if you look at running, I'll go through this quickly. I just want to show you that if you train too much, too hard, you break down. And functional training applies to this. 45 minutes of new beginners training, the injury rate is 54%. If they only train for 15 minutes, the injury rate is only 22%. So with beginners, and I know you probably have troops, talent squads, don't push them too hard, too early. Give them a chance to rest. Rest is an important part of functional training. So more is not always better. That's what I'm trying to say here. Now if we look at weak link testing, this is where training happens. This one's in Swedish. So if you do too much, there is a risk of overtraining. If you overtrain, they will not perform on the weekend. It's as simple as that. But if you don't give them enough, they undertrain. This is why our job as a conditioning expert is so important. Our job is not to write a list of exercises. Our job is to decide how do I get my athlete in this zone, in this window of opportunity. That's my job. Anybody can go into Runner's World magazine and look at how should I train for leading a loppet. Anyone can do that, and they do. But it takes a good skilled trainer, a good skilled therapist, a good skilled medicine doctor, sports medicine doctor, to put them in this window. That's what we're about. And all of our athletes in a team game have different windows. But normally, they train as a group. That's something to think about. So, when we do a NEURAC for treatment or training, weak link testing for training for weak link tests, it needs to occur inside this window. If it's too hard, they won't learn. They'll break down or they'll cheat. If it's not hard enough, there'll be no training effect. This is where the magic happens, and that's the hard part. Hopefully, if we weak link test correctly, we will isolate and integrate and have an effect quickly. You will get a spontaneous training effect. And they will take that out on the ice, and ideally, they will come back and say, wow, what a difference. That hip, I don't know what happened, but that hip is on. That hip is doing stuff out on the ice now that I've never experienced before. That's the kind of effect we're looking for. Now, where does this stuff happen? It can happen at a biomechanical level. Where are the forces? It can happen at a physiological level. What's happening with the signals between the brain and the body? Are we managing to make them work? And what's happening in the brain? What is my motor learning? What is my map of how I play ice hockey? What is my map of how I do figure skating? 3 different levels. It's not easy. There's a lot of stuff happening here. If we just look at these 2, right, there's something called tensegrity. Anybody with an engineering background will probably know what this is. Anyone who plays around with mobiles will probably know what this is. Anybody who builds model aeroplanes will probably know what this is. It's constructing wires and sticks that hold themselves up. I have this great geodesic tent from New Zealand. So when I go up to Sarek, I put it up and it keeps the wind off me. And it stays up on its own. So if I'm stuck on all these silly rocks that are really uncomfortable to sleep on, it still stays up. It's self-supporting. That's tensegrity. And the body is built on that. I can stand here because I have things pulling on the back and on the front and pushing up and pushing down, and it keeps me together. That's tensegrity. This building looks a little bit like it's got a bit of tensegrity thrown at it. So, this is what most bodies look like, especially elite athletes who stand here most of the time and do this all their lives. And then you stand them up, oh, and they're hopeless. They can't stand at the barbecue without leaning on something because they're not used to being up here. They've lost their tensegrity in this position. That's an important part of injury management. Ideally, this tent has nice guy ropes pulling in different directions to hold us up. Ideally. And these are the ones that come to us in the clinic because they've lost that tensegrity. This is tensegrity. Can anybody build this? I certainly could not. That is how the body is built. It's so complicated. It's beautiful. The tensegrity in the body is amazing. We could not do this in the garage or in the hobby room. And this is what it looks like out in the garden. This is tensegrity. Different things pulling in different directions to hold us up. Now imagine putting that on ice with guys coming and pushing you into the walls and a stick leaning forwards trying to hit a puck. It's really complicated. How do you design it? Well, it should look something like this. Different parts pulling on different parts. And if I break this, the whole thing falls down. If I tweak this little one in here, iliopsoas muscle, the whole thing falls down. That is how vulnerable we are. And our athletes are out there with 120 kilos slamming them into the wall and wondering why, oh, where's my tensegrity gone? So this is what we look like, and these are the types of muscles that are pulling us down or pulling us up, depending on the movement. Now, if you can match what happens on the ice to the way the tensegrity is designed, it's biomechanics, and understand the muscles that are holding everything together and how you can stimulate them, train them, you will have super athletes. It's not about lifting heavy. It's about balance. When I set my tent up and I pull too hard on the right, I know that the snow is going to do something to my tent which I will not enjoy in the morning. The tensegrity is what you're looking for, the balance between muscles. So how do you do that? Here's our tensegrity device. This is upside down. This actually stands up on its feet. I train this and this. I train hamstrings and back with a stable core by hanging in an unstable surface with forces on my body. That trains me to stand like this with good control. I can blow in any direction, regardless of how much snow is on my shoulders, regardless of how much wind is blowing. If I have tensegrity, I can stay there. And I can modify my position and come back. Modify and come back without losing control. That is functional training. This is not functional training. This is building the motor to be strong. It's giving me stiffer poles in my tent, but it's not allowing me to move sideways and rotate. That's functional. Here's another example. Consider the front of the body like a marquee, like a tent, and you need to be able to put tension in it in order for it to be strong. So it's sort of like this tensegrity model. So we're putting spending throughout the whole myofascial chain on the front, from the left leg to the right hip, and that allows me to stand here. That allows me to lean forwards and reach for something. See more of that in bandy than I do in ice hockey. That tensegrity is on the front side. This one is on the back side, and we need balance front and back. So you train both. This is tensegrity on the side of the body. Very important for anything to do with the foot connected to the floor. Because if your hip doesn't work, your feet can't work. And then you go to Le Blubbet and you buy a pair of insoles and you think it's going to fix everything. And it doesn't, because you still haven't fixed the tensegrity. All you've done is lift up the arch in the foot and given you the impression that you're more stable. The problem is here, not down here. So now we come to something called the SAID principle. If you're going to train the body, you have to be specific, and that will give you an adaptation. And that depends on what demands you place on the body. This is a well-known principle. Specific adaptation to impose demands. You can look up a guy called Bompa if you're interested. He writes all about this. So, lastly, if we look at the... Don't underestimate the brain. The brain is in everything we do. We don't know about it, it's subconscious, but it's there. It's happening in real time, milliseconds. We don't even know because we can't cope with all that information. But you need to train it in the body, in a safe environment, in order to take it out on the ice. You need to choose goal-directed movements. There's some stuff coming out of Denmark at the moment, a Canadian lady. It's fantastic, and it shows very clearly if you give someone a task, a goal, and it's involving strength or reaction time or coordination, the results will be much faster and much better because the brain is a problem solver. It wants to solve the problem. It doesn't want to decide which muscles are working. It wants to solve the problem. So if you build an environment and coach them to solve it the way you want to solve it as a trainer, they will learn much faster. So be goal-directed. If they're in that position, give them a stick and give them something to touch on the floor. Tell them to hit something. You will increase the brain space. You may not think that there's that much space in brains of athletes, but actually you can access more of that brain, that exists. You can access more of it by being goal-oriented. I can say that because I was an athlete once before. You've got motor neuron growth. You can actually grow new pathways to make things happen. And lastly, it's the effort, not the load. It's the effort that causes functional training changes. So make it difficult, but not necessarily heavy. And that'll be very different to what happens in a lifting environment. That'll be very different to what actually happens on the ice sometimes. They'll have forces that are 6-7 times their body weight. You don't need to do that with functional training in the gym. But make sure the effort is high, because then the brain connects. It's engaged. Tensegrity. That's the message I want to leave with you. Think about balancing the body. Think about being finesse rather than strong finesse. Thank you.